day 3. Here we are for day 4. That bench trial, McGlynn enters. He says one issue in the record may have to be sealed. Clears everyone out of the courtroom, including reporters. All right, start day 4. But he leaves the litigants in to discuss the issue. Now, I'm speculating here. It might be that last question the defense asked Tucker about why he left the military early due to an affair. All right, so I think that's what they may have decided they're going back to seal. So, after that, again, that's just my speculation. Not sure. I guess we'll have to wait and see what the official transcript says. Again, we won't have the transcript out until mid-December. That's why I'm doing this, just to get this all out, so you guys have access to this. If you didn't want to go to my X page and filter through all of that. And again, I will also post each one of these day 1, 2, 3, and 4 in one page each, so you can go through and look at this yourself. But anyways, all right, so back at it here. We've got the courtroom reopened, back on the record. Defense calls their final witness. It's Jason Dempsey, Lieutenant Colonel. Dempsey explains his family's history in the military. He went to West Point, qualified with the M16, ran a basic training unit, discusses terms of squad, platoon, company, battalion, brigade, division, and corps. Reiterates M16 training with semi-automatic and full auto. Burst mode described. Selector switch explained. Training on only semi-automatic firearms. Or training on only semi-automatic. So he claims that they only trained on semi-automatic. He was trained on semi-automatic, never on full burst or auto. Learned about military doctrine at West Point, gives his definition as fundamentals of policies to follow, where doctrine ends and technical manuals begin. Says at West Point, he learned about joint doctrine that guides Army, Navy, Marines, and now Space Force. Says military ranges up to 530 members. I've seen that countered in some other areas. Dempsey says cadets would carry doctrine with them. Exhibit 263 presented. Infantry rifle platoon and squad from January 2024. He graduated West Point in 1983. Reported to Fort Benning in Georgia. Trained at Airborne School. Weapons trained on all assets for infantry, M16, other firearms, anti-tank systems, AP4, exposed to 60mm mortars, 120mm mortars, 155 howitzer, 50 cal machine guns, vehicle-mounted systems, 25mm cannon, a couple of machine guns, weapons with built-in extendable tripod, belt-fed, spare barrel. He talks about that being what a machine gun is. Rate of fire requires the barrel overheats, and machine gun does not refer to M16 or M4. So when he says machine gun, he's talking about these much bigger guns that come with a separate barrel so they can change that out, and it's belt fed. He's not talking about M16s or M4s when he talks about machine gun. Is that a point for the plaintiffs? Defense asks Dempsey about Ranger School, put in harsh environment, woods, desert, mountains, swamp, all different phases. They're all tested and graded, carrying different firearms. Have to pass to advance. He did. He graduated Ranger School in 1994, stationed at Fort Bragg, not Fort Liberty. Says M4 is a shorter barrel, more convenient, has semi-automatic and burst mode. Dempsey describes duties at 82nd Airborne, prepared for projected invasion of Haiti, qualifies platoon on weapon systems with dry fire, plain fire, external evaluation, exercise in different environments, raids, ambushes, and standard attacks. Didn't ultimately invade Haiti. He said he was on a plane with his M4 before Carter and Powell made a deal, and then the plane turned around. Some history I wasn't familiar with. The defense asks Dempsey about deposition of developing doctrine, says since deposition, the chief of staff invited him to West Point last week, where he reviewed, edited, and offered suggestions. So during deposition, he said he wasn't involved in helping with military doctrine, but just last week, he says he was asked to go help with some military doctrine. Dempsey says he was issued new firearm, M4, when transferring to different base. Had semi-automatic and burst, the M4 did. Discusses airborne operations, raids, helicopter insertions in compound or urban environment. Had full suite of weapons. Ranger regiments included Barrett sniper and 84mm rifle. He would train against specific opponents for certain threats, always trained in semi-automatic mode, he says. He discussed other training for different schools. At Bradley Fighting Course, Dempsey said, trained on vehicles, different machine gun, cannon, and other systems. Commanded company with up to 160 people, trained to fight in Iraq pre-9/11 and invasion as deterrent to Saddam. Trained on M4 only with semi-automatic. Again, he reiterates, sent to Iraq, carried M4, carried M9, discussed training in Kuwait for full-on company-level maneuvers, extensive trench lines, trench live fire with M4, hand grenades, tanks, other weapons, planned large-scale breaches, demine, destroy other obstacles, etc. Dempsey describes training for close quarters after he gave up command of the company in July of 2001, asked to teach at West Point, spent one tour teaching cadets in political science, got a doctoral degree from Columbia, followed that, went to West Point to teach as instructor and professor. After Iraq war kicked off, Rangers were then set, cadet training as an officer, he says. Defense questions of Dempsey continue. Deployed to Iraq in 2005, was unique, political and economic oversight of how to run Iraq. Tested with handling conflicts among the Kurdish and Sunni groups. He says he carried an M9, patrolling with Blackwater with an M4, with National Guard, carried an M16. After, he went to Fort Leavenworth studying joint doctrine, military history, operations, tabletop war game exercises. From there, and again, they spent a lot of time with Dempsey, the defense did. From there, Dempsey says he was assigned to 3rd Brigade Mountain Division, trained for deploying to suburbs of Baghdad, individual marksmanship, no more M16s in inventory, so he carried an M4. Sent to Afghanistan after training, focused on helicopter insertions, mix of urban environments. As operations officer, planning, training, and managing deployed operations. Once deployed, he sets up a headquarters. Defense questions of Dempsey continue. Plans, mission for Afghanistan. But then we have a brief recess. Back to it. Defense continuing their direct examination of Dempsey. Talks about Afghanistan. Task force chosen. Served as senior leadership in the reshuffling assets. Then in 2009, Task Force Spartan. There he managed to review operations for plans and attach aviation squad. Allocated assets for unit level operations. Counter IED elements, etc. Dempsey says that he'd adhere to standard operating procedure and other guidance, things decided before they got there. Says he operated in the run-up to the first Iraq presidential election, the Bo Bergdahl AWOL situation. He said troops fired weapons probably daily, carried M4, full suite, and probably 2,000 rounds, I think. They fired at least one a day, 6 times a day. Fire, they would receive fire, they could be hit by IEDs. Can't quantify the number of rounds. In 2009, stayed in operations for pre-deployments, new orders, individual training, and then relinquished role in the summer of 2010. Extensive after-action reviews. Rotated out of the division. The White House program he was accepted to take Americans to inspire civic involvement. He worked with first and second ladies to design and launch joining forces to mobilize business and civil society to support veteran families. Then put name in to be an advisor, then on White House task force for veterans and families on housing and overhaul of veteran transition programs. Then he went to the 101st Airborne at Fort Campbell, commanded advisory team there, prepared for deploying forces. Training was a team at squad level, basic weapons qualifications, and ad hoc squads. Dempsey discusses training on marksmanship with the M4, only trained on semi-automatic mode. A lot of chaos in subsequent deployments to Afghanistan. Advisory team for Afghan border police. Conducted foot patrols, not regularly, a few times a week, he said. Carried the M9 service pistol and M4. Redeployed spring of 2013. Then took job with chairman of Joint Chiefs at Pentagon. Asked to travel abroad in 2014. Somebody in the live comment says this is irrelevant. There was a ton of background on these guys, their resumes, all the different trainings they've been involved in. I don't know if that was just to build expertise, but this was a trial. This was straight up a trial. It's not like the appeals court where each side's given 10 minutes and then that's it. No, this was a trial. They had to build that record, and all of this is part of the record. Back to it. Retired from Army 2015, Lieutenant Colonel, had a lot of fun, been in 22 years, had 2 kids, time to do something different, he said. Now focused on veterans, higher education, part of the Veteran Advisory Council for productive discussions around weapons, focused on suicide, firearm prevention, talks to organizations with that focus. Dempsey now asked to focus on role in litigation. Exhibit 214 presented, asked by state to review use of firearms, review reports, drafted reports, addressed utility use case of M4 in combat and use in firing modes, based his opinion on documents and how they had been employed in his experience. Declarations entered into evidence. Says infantry issued M4, before that M16. Says always trained in semi-automatic. He said that at least 5, 6, 7 times. McGlynn says, haven't we gone through that before? Says no one's challenging his expertise. Says that he wants to hear his opinions. So Dempsey says he fired in semi-automatic as most effective and reliable to place well-placed fire. With burst, second and third bullet thrown off. Weapon can jam. Machine gun's meant to be rapid fire. M4 is not, Dempsey says. In Iraq, he says Saddam had large army and could pose existential threat. Discusses peer threat. Dempsey says facing certain forces, most effective form of fire needed to kill enemy. Precision fire different from suppressive fire. Suppressive fire should still be accurate. Says best way to deliver accurate fire is semi-automatic mode. Dempsey says doesn't recommend M4 for suppressive fire. Discusses using team rifles for suppressive fire at platoon level. Different squads use 2 M249 weapons. Gives movement capabilities with best, most accurate. The M249 jams. Won't use full auto with M4. It could jam. Always only trained in semi-automatic, he said. Expected semi-automatic mode engaging enemy with M4. Never used burst or auto in battle personally. So no further questions from the defense. The plaintiffs take their turn to question Dempsey. Asked about personal ownership of a SIG AR semi-automatic rifle with 30-round magazine standard. Purchased additional mags. Has attachments. Added pistol grip. Barrel shroud. Flash suppressor. Dempsey says he reviewed Illinois' gun ban law. Agrees Illinois bans rifles he owns for personal use. Says his opinion. Again, this might be a point for the plaintiffs. Says his opinion is for training, not banning outright. He wants training and accountability. This is the defense witness, Dempsey, saying his opinion is for training, not banning outright. He wants training and accountability. Says he's not an engineer, gunsmith, or has trained others in private life. He is not a self-defense instructor. Dempsey says he's trained others for hand-to-hand combat. Says he didn't engage with peer enemy in combat, but was in combat. Says he never trained troops for burst or full auto. Plaintiffs point to Dempsey's deposition to that effect. Says Army's not trained for burst or full auto. Deposition focuses on Dempsey saying that he never trained infantry for full auto or burst. Deposition later says he trained others exclusively on semi-automatic. Says the Army not prepared to use full auto. Dempsey says the Army's not prepared to use full auto. Says M4s don't have full auto. Says don't train on burst, and Army not prepared to use bursts. He never recommended to any Army that they issue semi-automatic only rifles. Again, he was asked by the plaintiffs, have you ever recommended to the Army that they only have semi-automatic only rifles? And Dempsey says he's never recommended to the Army that they issue semi-automatic only rifles. Dempsey disagrees with defendant's witness, Colonel Tucker, that Army shouldn't get rid of full auto or burst modes for rifles. Again, Tucker, a defense witness, said that he does not recommend getting rid of full auto or burst from military. Dempsey disagrees with that. Dempsey says he's discussed how two others in special forces about full auto and burst being insufficient. He says he's reviewed documents and depositions about new combat rifles being adopted. He's asked about his opinion on rifles without knowing of the newly adopted XM7. Apparently, the military went ahead and adopted a new XM7, which is full auto. Now, this came after Dempsey retired. But asked about opinion on rifles without knowledge of newly adopted XM7, correct. Has full auto capable rifle. He says, I'll take your word for it. Could take a decade to implement, he says. Exhibit 28 shown. It's an article about the XM7 rifle adopted by the Army. Rifle depicted does not have burst. No explanation why Army adopted full auto if full auto isn't necessary, correct? Then he talks about Army acquisition process. He acknowledges all other Army round world issue their Army select fire. Dempsey says that he would recommend semi-automatic only. Discusses colloquial, the term big Army. He He says he never made such suggestions to Big Army. Plaintiffs discuss H&K full auto firearm. Not familiar with that. Plaintiffs discuss Dempsey's personal experience in room entry. The deposition says non-contested. Reads rest of the question from Depot. The deposition at McGlynn's request. Dempsey says he reviewed room entrance via video. Not in deposition. Reads deposition response says no. Acknowledged he never personally cleared a bunker. Discusses doctrine, says attack while on patrol by aircraft. You give a wall of fire. Exhibit 32 is presented. It's an infantry rifle platoon and squad. Cited in Dempsey report. Document discusses in hostile attack from air, you respond with, quote, all available automatic weapons. Doesn't disclose what weapons. Dempsey discusses final protective line. He recommends any fire that doesn't render self-combat incapable by jamming a weapon. He suggests semi-automatic. Then we take a brief break. Coming back to it, on the record again, me in the courtroom going crazy on my phone, sending out these posts. So what we're doing here, we're on day 4 now, reviewing this, just over 2 hours of this recording. Back on record with plaintiff's cross-examination of Dempsey. Back to final protective line discussion of Exhibit 32. The document says, spare no ammo in repelling enemy assault. Acknowledges no doctrine says, do not use burst full auto. Dempsey says, best not to use mode that could jam. Acknowledges document doesn't say anything about using only semi-automatic rifles. Dempsey still recommended using only semi-automatic. Asked about final line of defense, Dempsey says soldier must do what they can to stay alive. Asked about salvo and other reports, says he's not familiar. Again, says doesn't recommend burst or auto as a waste of ammo and jamming. Exhibit 32 presented. Plaintiffs ask about the time of suppression and use of automatic weapons with no limitation of what weapon. Dempsey says M4 wasn't full auto at the time. Plaintiffs move to strike that. McGlynn overrules that. Exhibit 33 presented. Armor and mechanized infantry document. Features discussion of time of suppression from a sustained rate of fire with automatic weapons. Dempsey says M4 is not full auto. Plaintiffs say document doesn't say a word about semi-automatic. Plaintiffs say that Army has now issued full auto rifles. Dempsey says he has no opinion if that's why they moved back to full auto. Exhibit 31, Dempsey's report about personal ownership of semi-automatic firearm, 6 Sauer 516 replica to M4 without burst function, doesn't know material of civilian rifles, metal treatment, trigger group materials, etc. Says he hasn't tested abuse testing on it. Didn't do any scientific testing to prove civilian rifles same as M4 without burst. Plaintiffs ask about standards needed for military firearms. Exhibit 36 is shown, lays out specs for military firearms needed for select fire. Dempsey says he's not aware of that. Discussion of standards for civilian arms, he's not aware. Discussion of standards for military spec, says he's not aware. Says he's never helped with doctrine in deposition. That changed in today's testimony. We touched on that earlier when the defense brought that up. Dempsey talks about need for well-aimed fire, says he's thankful he fired no rounds in combat in Middle East. Asked about side-by-side testing of firearm modes, Dempsey's deposition is then shown. Question asked again. Defense objects on vagueness in the deposition raised. McGlynn overrules that. Dempsey says answer to vague question was no. Or answer to that vague question was no. So interesting kind of back and forth there. Guess you had to be there. Back to Dempsey deposition discussion about burst and semi-automatic comparisons where semi-automatic is better. Plaintiffs say that he's never conducted such experiments. Says he's only engaged in full auto a handful of times. Asked about hypothetical of China invasion, he would recommend civilian arms depending on manufacturer. Deposition says auto fires wasteful from rifle when machine guns available. What if machine guns not available? The plaintiffs ask. Dempsey says accurate fires needed. Says machine gun not needed for suppression. Exhibit 31 shown, discusses automatic riflemen. Dempsey report says no need for automatic riflemen. If killed, burst is available, correct? Dempsey says no. Dempsey says those left can get to the automatic rifleman's weapon. Says burst fire gets one round close to the enemy, rest is just noise, Dempsey said. They discuss peer opponents in Dempsey report. He says automatic rifleman is always available but that can be lost, he acknowledges. If automatic rifleman weapon is destroyed, M4 is left, soon to be the XM7 full auto rifle, correct? Dempsey says he's on a board of the gun control group Everytown. He's not aware of the Mimiki brief they filed in the Beavis case. Nothing further from plaintiffs. Break for lunch. After lunch, court resumes. Defense redirect of Dempsey begins. Questions personal ownership of semi-automatic rifle. Says it was a commemorative rifle from his time overseas. Says he does not use it for self-defense. Asked about the technical specification knowledge. Says that he was able to command troops without knowing that. No further redirect. So, McGlynn addresses Dempsey. Dempsey's the final witness here. All right. McGlynn addresses Dempsey, says he expects to go. He goes to sleep every night thinking about how to protect people. Dempsey acknowledges that. Judge says Dempsey surely understands the turmoil and anguish troops undergo, led people into confrontation, and has important experience. Asks a few questions now. McGlynn asks about peer opponents. What about Third World? Would U.S. be considered superior to that? Not particularly, Your Honor. McGlynn says it appears Dempsey is urging for well-placed rounds and that semi-automatic's not useful, and with full auto, it sprays all around. Dempsey says yes. To have full control, must have specialized weapon. Yes. Asked about magazines needed. Must be well armed. Correct. Training about firearm upon enemy. Do you limit or keep firing to neutralize enemy? Dempsey says you want to hit and kill the enemy. Depends on how good marksman is. McGlynn says a lot of time is spent training soldiers to be good shooters. Correct. Firearm protective line. Have to hold this line or in serious trouble. You could lose the engagement. Dempsey says correct. Sometimes no other way out. McGlynn says, what do you say to fellow citizen in similar position? Peer opponent or greater opponent. Recommendation? Dempsey said he would take 5 minutes to find weapon and keys. He says it's quicker to leave the house with his phone. Asked about his semi-automatic firearms. Useful for self-defense? Dempsey says no. Can't imagine scenario using such. Wouldn't recommend, he says. Untrained shooters, other weapons he would pick up, Dempsey says. So interesting. When they're talking about peer opponents, McGlynn equates that to home defense. Again, McGlynn's questions in all of this, I think, is something that probably should be highlighted all on its own. The separate video, who knows? How many invaders might change what you recommend? Haven't thought of it, Dempsey said. What about fatigue? A shotgun? Recommend smaller shotgun. Important to train with weapons focused on accountability? Correct. I stand by that. So he's asked about, making sure people are trained and accountable with their firearms. He stands by that, he says. You don't like full auto in confrontation to preserve ammunition and take better shots? Dempsey says yes. Thank you for your service. No further questions. Dempsey dismissed. No more witnesses. So that was it, right? And here we are at the tail end of this 4-day trial. This is a rough transcript. The actual transcript's not going to be released until mid-December, at least how I read the court docket. But then the litigants, they went on to discuss other exhibits to submit, some set aside for closing arguments. Start with the plaintiffs, so we'll hear the closing arguments now. Case addresses constitutional question whether commonly owned semi-automatic firearms can be banned by Illinois, the plaintiffs say. They say that it doesn't stand constitutional muster. They say pistol grip, forward grip, collapsible stock, barrel shroud, threaded barrel, changing magazines, more rounds, useful for self-defense, and is not a militaristic feature. They note that the state's expert, Tucker, said changing mags leaves you vulnerable. Plaintiff's expert, Watt, said people are on their own in self-defense. Banned firearms are useful for self-defense, they said. They say that such guns with features are ideal for self-defense. They say no military in world issues semi-automatic only rifles. Military spec requires burst or full auto. Even Tucker said don't prohibit burst or full auto from military. Plaintiffs continue in closing remarks, say firearms regulated by the ban are commonly owned for self-defense. Their features are commonly owned for lawful purposes and train with defense in mind. Experts recognize use of such for self-defense. As Pulaski, the only Illinois resident to testify, the owner of Piasaw Armory, recommended semi-automatic firearms for self-defense before the ban. Shotguns with detachable mags or magazines with more than 5 rounds are common for self-defense, provided lengthy amount of documents to support that, the plaintiffs say. Court should find Protect Illinois Communities Act unconstitutional and enter a permanent injunction against Illinois from enforcing it. Plaintiffs end their close. States closing. They say the key question is about material difference between civilian and military weapons. Experts agree that military trains with M16 and M4 on semi-automatic. Other facts in focus. Both have grips, adjustable stocks, flash suppressors, etc. With high rates of fire to kill enemies. Features are same, except selective fire switch. Quotes EB, quotes Ronkanen about innovations for AR rifles, but not any changes to make safer to civilians being shot at. Says plaintiffs admit both civilian and military fire same ammunition. Other facts: Illinois law prohibits .50 caliber, rarely sold, can hit target from a mile away. The defense says that Watt says keep AR pistols out of traditional pistol training. No one told us they were used for duck hunting. Said that hearsay from Pulaski about why people buy them. No evidence provided, they said. Ronkanen said demand increased after federal ban. Lifted. EB said he prefers AR-15 for self-defense only because full auto isn't legal. Finally, the state says plaintiff's witness Watt didn't provide real evidence, just anecdotes from people who self-select for his Warriors Creed course. State says banned semi-automatic guns aren't suitable for self-defense, says it fits dangerous and unusual weapon, and definition between what's good for civilians and police. They urge the state, the judge, to uphold the law, and they end closing. All right, so McGlynn says it's an important case. And this is where we get to the end, and McGlynn, at least from my perspective, kind of threw a bit of a curveball here. McGlynn says it's an important case, expects filings on history and tradition, says when the case started he questioned where this will go. He said to tour the East St. Louis area, he called sacred sites all around, says important to recognize people sustained losses. On 8th Street, there was a hospital where he was born. He projects an image from 1917, and it says 70 here, but it was 1917 rather. Let me see if I can pull this image up, because this is the image that he projected on the screen. He pulls this image up from 1917, the race riots, and the arrow, and you can see the debris around there. He said to him it looks like Vietnam, but the arrow pointing to that building, that's the building everyone was in the courtroom. That's the building everyone was in the courtroom. Again, just fascinating to have him pull that up. But McGlynn says it's an important case, projects that image, looking south, shows burned areas from a riot. A man's house was burned for being black, he said. Sacred sites. He says, end of court parking lot was old Broadway theater. Word got out, black families were hiding there, burned down. Nobody escaped. During course of riots, 100 blacks were armed, shooting back. Rioters said that's not fair. They went to the National Guard to complain. The Guard then gave safe passage to the black victims across the Eads Bridge. Another area, line of demarcation, he says. Points to the picture, arrow of building surrounded by debris. Building his court we're in now. Says it looks like Vietnam. Says everything families owned was burned by the mob. McGlynn said all black houses set on fire, one by one, as people escaped to other houses that were also burned. One man beat in the head with an iron pipe with a noose around his neck. Not long enough to hang, so they dragged him. 4th and Broadway, McGlynn says there was a Fountain of Youth Park. St. Louis Reporter sees bodies with one guy being pulled to hang with people saying pull for East St. Louis. The mob prevented ambulances from helping, stopped streetcars and dragged blacks out and beat them, he said. 4th and Division, they found the body of a kid cremated, hiding. Others hiding in home nearby, frightened. Fire from house to house while theirs was collapsing. Horribly burned, community lost everything. McGlynn wonders if they tried to make a stand, poorly armed, fleeing from mob, jumping in the Mississippi, off bridges for certain death. What if they had some of these weapons? Who knows, he said. Then he discusses Tulsa, Oklahoma, I believe 1921. Black neighborhoods, very nice. Same thing happened. Mob set upon them, burned and killed. More recent, Aurora, Colorado, international gangsters, well armed, going into attacking doors in an apartment complex. Video occurred 30 days after police were called, he said. They were on their own. Maybe a little kid hiding under the bed. Mom or the bad guy's gone. Part of our history, he said. The judge, the federal judge in this case, says going to confront evil people. Going to be called to defend yourself, your community. With respect to what we have here today, the Second Amendment has nothing to say, he said, some may feel. She's too old, lost her luster, maybe too senile. He says before leaving East St. Louis, stop by these sites. Never know what's going to happen to you in your life. That's why this case is important. He doesn't question the sincerity of any of the litigants on either side. Then he gives 30 days to submit briefs, and we are adjourned. So there you go. Oh, that's 2 hours and 15 minutes. I will link to each one of these: day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. These were rough transcripts of the 4-day bench trial for the challenge of Illinois' gun and magazine ban. Greatly appreciate you guys being here. Not sure how the live stream did, but this will all be on one show. All right, so one full 2 hour, 17 minutes. That's what it's going to be. All right, so just wanted to get that out to you. All right, because we're not going to get the actual transcript until mid-December. What time is it? It's almost 6 o'clock here. All right. Hope you enjoyed a special Sunday stream here with Bishop on Air. Greatly appreciate it. Yeah, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, all right? Make it happen. With Bishop on Air. All right, really do appreciate you guys sticking around. Those who did, I think at one point we got like 160 viewers, but right now about 80 some odd of you guys hanging out. To those who did make it, listen, share with it in the live chat here. How many times did this break up? Like, do I have 5 live videos on my feed now from this? If so, what is going on? I thought I got all that figured out. I guess we'll get the bugs worked out here. So yeah, looks like 1, 2. There's 3 live videos there. Okay. Again, the entirety recorded locally. So the entire segment, the 2 hours and 15 minutes, it'll be there for you guys to go through. If you want to bring it back up, share it with your friends. So I'll have that uploaded here in a bit. Don't forget, like, subscribe, hit that notification bell for America's Talking Network. I know a lot of people have been like, hey, Bishop, what happened to your channel? Listen, the daily morning show is at America's Talking Network, all right? So join me each and every weekday morning, 8 o'clock Central Time. We'll come back together and, review the latest in the gun ban stuff, but also everything else that's going on. What's happening in Chicago, what's happening at the State House. We got a lot of election stuff coming up. America's Talking Network on YouTube. So go do it. Check it out. Every weekday morning. Shorter, concise segments, not 2.5 hours. That's what we're looking at here. All right, so appreciate you guys. Ernie's Arms Accessories, appreciate that. Patriots from Warsaw. TK Randall, Randy, John, H. Manning, Werewolf 6, Robert, Dollar Bill Me, Captain Mike, Ryan, Christopher. Who else we got up in here? Tired Mind. I don't know. I'm smelling some soup that my wife's cooking, so I'm going to go and get that. Maybe drink a beer. I don't know. All right, guys. It was choppy a bit, but it worked out. Again, full segment, isolated. It'll be uploaded here soon. Have a wonderful day. I got to get out of here. Enjoy your Sunday.